Steel screamed against steel as the conveyor belt shuddered to a halt, stranding half-finished Thunderbirds directly above the maintenance pit where the safety grating should have been. 9 foremen climbed down into the darkness, flashlights cutting through oil mist, boots scraping ladder rungs, unaware that every emergency exit had been welded shut 3 hours earlier. This is the story of how an entire family turned an assembly line into an execution chamber, and why no one who knew the truth ever spoke to police. The Jefferson Avenue plant squatted along Detroit's east side like a rusted cathedral, its windows filmed with decades of metal dust and exhaust. Inside, the midnight shift moved through air thick with the smell of burning rubber, hot solder, and the particular sourness of men working past exhaustion. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead in rhythm with the press's chunk hiss, a mechanical heartbeat that never stopped except when something broke or someone bled. Before we go deeper into this dark chapter of American manufacturing, I want to know, where are you watching from right now? What time is it where you are? Drop a comment below and let me know. And if stories like this fascinate you, hit that like button and subscribe, because what you're about to hear has been buried in union files and insurance claims for over half a century. The Jefferson cousins, Marcus, Deshaun, Raymond, and Thomas, had worked line 7 for a combined 32 years, their hands scarred from the same presses, their backs bent from the same repetitive motions. They lived within 4 blocks of each other, in Brush Park row houses that shook every time the number 16 bus rumbled past. Marcus bolted driver's side doors. Deshaun attached hoods. Raymond worked the spot weld station. Thomas operated the overhead crane that swung chassis frames from station to station like mechanical pendulums. They made $3.40 an hour, barely enough. Management had implemented efficiency improvements in March of 1966, corporate language, that meant the line ran 12% faster while headcount dropped by 8 workers. The cousins adjusted, moving quicker, skipping bathroom breaks, ignoring the tremor developing in Marcus's left hand from gripping the pneumatic drill for 10-hour stretches without rest. Then came the first accident. April 14th, 1966, 2:17 a.m. Deshaun's station partner, a quiet man named Leon Briggs who'd just bought his first house on a VA loan, reached across the line to clear a jam. The safety interlock supposed to prevent the press from cycling while the cage was open had been bypassed 3 months earlier to maintain production quotas. The 2-ton stamping die dropped with the sound of a car crash compressed into half a second. Leon Briggs lost his right arm above the elbow. The plant doctor wrapped the stump. The foreman filed an incident report, citing failure to follow safety protocol. Management sent Leon home with a fruit basket, actually sent a fruit basket, cellophane wrapped with a card reading, "Wishing you a speedy recovery and a permanent disability discharge that paid $68 a month." Not enough to keep the house he'd saved 3 years to buy. The cousins filed 17 separate safety complaints between April and June, documented the bypassed interlocks, the missing guards. The way the lines increased speed made it impossible to clear jams safely. Every form vanished somewhere between the union rep's desk and the executive offices on the 3rd floor, where carpets, muffled footsteps, and secretaries answered phones with voices smooth as advertising copy. In July, management hired temporary workers to fill gaps left by injuries and quits, teenagers mostly, kids desperate enough to take dangerous work for $2.15 an hour. One of them was Darnell Hughes, 17, saving money for community college, always early for his shift, always asking questions about how the machines worked. Safety interlocks still bypassed, guards still removed. July 29th, a stamping press designed to shape fenders caught Darnell Hughes mid-chest when he bent to retrieve a dropped bolt. The sound brought the entire line to a halt, not mechanically, but because grown men stopped working to vomit or pray or simply stare at what industrial machinery does to human bodies when safeguards disappear in pursuit of production quotas. This time, no fruit basket. Management called it tragic and unpreventable, and increased the line speed by another 4% the following week. The union rep, a soft-handed man who drove a Cadillac and played golf with plant supervisors, advised patience. Said he was working through proper channels. Said these things took time. The Jeffersons stopped filing forms. Instead, they started staying late, studying blueprints Marcus had photographed with a borrowed camera during his lunch breaks. Emergency shutoffs. Fire doors. The serpentine path the main conveyor took as it snaked over the maintenance pit, a 15-foot deep concrete trench where mechanics could access the underside of vehicles without lifts. They noticed the pit's metal safety grating was bolted, not welded, removable. They noticed the control booth where one operator managed conveyor speeds and press activation had a clear sight line to the entire pit area, but no windows facing the administrative offices. They noticed the emergency exits on the east side of the building were old fire doors that could be sealed from outside with simple welds that would look, to inspectors, like age-related deterioration. Revenge in an industrial setting requires patience. What would you do? Working alongside machines that had already claimed an arm and a life, watching management accelerate toward the next inevitable casualty while your complaints gathered dust. Would you keep filing paperwork? Walk away? Or would you start measuring the distance between justice and the factory floor? The opportunity arrived disguised as overtime. Labor Day weekend, 1966. A holiday Monday that meant triple-time pay for anyone willing to push through a rush order of executive model Thunderbirds promised to a dealership chain by Tuesday morning. 9 supervisors and foremen volunteered. Men who spent their days in offices, who'd never worked a press or felt metal shavings embed in their forearms, who saw production numbers as abstractions rather than the accumulated exhaustion of human bodies. 3 shifts until catastrophe. The Jeffersons volunteered too, naturally. Someone had to operate the machines. Someone had to make sure everything ran exactly according to plan, the plan management knew nothing about, the plan that had been refined over 12 weeks of whispered conversations in row house kitchens and careful reconnaissance during authorized bathroom breaks. Saturday night, September 3rd. The plant hummed with skeleton crew efficiency. Marcus worked his station. Deshawn attached hoods with the precision of 15 years' practice. Raymond's welder threw blue-white sparks that danced across safety glasses. Thomas guided chassis frames along their predetermined path, and in the maintenance pit, the safety grating quietly disappeared. Thomas Jefferson's calloused hands moved across stolen architectural drawings spread over his kitchen table at 3 a.m., tracing ventilation shafts with a carpenter's pencil, while his wife pretended to sleep in the next room. The factory blueprints, photographed in segments during authorized breaks and reassembled with tape, revealed something management had forgotten. The Jefferson Avenue plant was designed in 1942 as a potential wartime munitions facility, which meant redundant lockdown systems that could seal sections airtight in case of sabotage or explosion. Those systems still functioned, waiting dormant in walls thick with 40 years of paint. The preparation consumed August. Not frantic preparation, the methodical kind that looks identical to normal routine. Marcus began arriving 15 minutes early for his midnight shifts, using the time to test emergency shutoffs, confirming which ones triggered alarms and which ones died silent. He discovered that the main conveyor's emergency brake, a red lever behind a glass panel near the control booth, had a 7-second delay before engaging, designed to prevent sudden stops that might damage partially assembled vehicles. 7 seconds. Long enough for half a chassis to clear a station. Long enough for something positioned precisely to drop into a 15-foot pit. Deshawn studied the foreman's patterns, noting which ones smoked outside the east loading dock, which ones used the executive bathroom on the 3rd floor, which ones stayed close to the main assembly area. He documented their habits in a pocket notebook disguised as a prayer journal, the kind of small book that drew no attention when pulled out during breaks. From a union meeting transcript, August 17, 1966. Brother Jefferson inquired about holiday overtime opportunities. Management confirms triple time rate for Labor Day weekend skeleton crew. Volunteers needed for executive rush order. Raymond Jefferson had worked as a welder before the plant, learning his trade in a Navy shipyard where precision meant the difference between watertight hulls and catastrophic flooding. He knew exactly how to seal a door so it looked like structural failure rather than sabotage a bead of weld hidden in the gap between frame and jamb. Barely visible unless you knew where to look, strong enough that a grown man couldn't force it open, even with full body weight. He practiced on the door of his garden shed until the technique became muscle memory. The Jeffersons never discussed the plan in the plant itself. No whispered conversations near the time clock. No meaningful glances across the assembly floor. They communicated through their children cousins who played together after school, passing messages disguised as kids' gossip. Uncle Marcus says dinners at 7 meant the timeline was confirmed. Aunt Sarah needs you to check her basement meant blueprints required review. This level of operational security wasn't paranoia. It was necessity, born from watching Leon Briggs lose an arm and Darnell Hughes lose his life, while official reports rewrote reality into worker error and tragic accidents. They understood that documentation was weapon and witness both, that anything spoken within factory walls might find its way to the wrong ears. The plant's phone system ran through a central switchboard in the administrative office, 6 lines total, all routed through an operator station that went unmanned after 5 p.m. on weekends. Cutting communication meant accessing the mechanical relay room, a locked closet on the 2nd floor, where the physical connections between internal lines and the outside world could be severed with simple wire cutters. Thomas had a key, not stolen, borrowed from a janitor who owed him favors, copied at a hardware store on Gratiot Avenue for 35 cents, returned before its absence was noticed. Every component was legal, every action traceable to legitimate purposes. Wire cutters belonged in a factory. Welding equipment was standard issue. Removing safety grating for maintenance was documented procedure. The genius lay in combination, in timing, in understanding that industrial facilities operated on assumptions of good faith that could be weaponized by those who'd watched good faith die alongside teenagers on assembly lines. September 2nd, Friday afternoon. The volunteer list for holiday weekend overtime finalized. 9 supervisors and foremen, 4 Jefferson cousins, 3 other line workers who'd been carefully vetted through casual conversation and shared grievances. Management authorized the skeleton crew with barely a glance. Triple-time rates were cheaper than missing the dealership deadline. The foremen who volunteered weren't monsters in the dramatic sense. They were middle managers protecting their own positions. Men who'd learned that questioning safety protocols meant questioning profit margins, which meant questioning their continued employment. They had families, mortgages, children in parochial schools. They'd made calculations that prioritized their comfort over others' survival. Complicity has 1,000 quiet faces. Plant Supervisor Gerald Mackey, 47, 3 kids, deacon at Sacred Heart Baptist. Assistant Foreman Robert Chen, 32, saved enough to buy his parents a house. Line Chief Vincent Delacroix, 51, 6 months from retirement, with a pension that required no disciplinary marks on his record. Each had signed off on safety bypass authorizations. Each had dismissed injury reports as worker carelessness. Each had accepted bonuses tied to production quotas that demanded human bodies move faster than human bodies safely could. Saturday morning, September 3rd. The plant stood nearly empty. Just the skeleton crew and the hum of machines warming up for a 36-hour push. Fluorescent lights reflected off polished concrete floors, still stained where Darnell Hughes had bled out 7 weeks earlier. Stains the janitorial staff couldn't quite scrub away. Dark patches shaped like accusation. Marcus arrived at his station carrying a lunch pail that contained sandwiches and a pair of heavy-duty bolt cutters. Deshawn clocked in with his usual thermos, inside which hydraulic line cutters nested against coffee-soaked rags. Raymond's welding kit included regulation equipment and a portable acetylene torch, small enough to work in tight spaces like door jambs. Thomas mounted the control booth at 11:58 p.m. taking his position at the master panel where switches controlled every press, every conveyor, every automated system in a facility designed to assemble 60 vehicles per shift. From this position, he could see the entire factory floor. The serpentine conveyor path, the stamping presses, the spot weld stations, and the maintenance pit where safety grading should have been, but wasn't anymore. The grading had been removed during the previous shift, signed out as scheduled maintenance, stored in a supply closet where it would be discovered Monday morning by confused day shift mechanics who'd find no maintenance order in the logbook. No order meant no investigation. Just another administrative mix-up in a facility where paperwork routinely disappeared. Midnight struck. The conveyor lurched into motion. Unfinished Thunderbird chassis began their journey from bare frame to rolling sculpture, each station adding components in choreographed sequence stores: hoods, fenders, glass, chrome, the incremental transformation of steel into status symbol. The foremen walked the floor in clusters, clipboards documenting production pace, occasionally shouting instructions over machine noise. They never looked down. Why would they? The floor had been safe yesterday. The floor would be safe tomorrow. The floor was always safe for men whose bodies never touched the machinery. At 12:47 a.m., the main conveyor stopped. Not the emergency stop, just a routine halt. The kind that happened a dozen times per shift when parts needed adjustment or spacing required correction. Chassis number 17 sat directly above the maintenance pit, its frame rails straddling empty space where grading should have provided solid footing. Check the alignment. Mackey called to the night crew, his voice carrying authority earned through 20 years of telling others to risk what he wouldn't. Something's jamming the sequence. The Jeffersons exchanged no glances, made no signals. They simply continued working their stations, focused on tasks that required their complete attention, too busy to notice supervisors gathering near the pit, too absorbed in labor to see 9 men approach the ladder that descended into darkness. What they'd planned for 12 weeks was about to unfold in 12 minutes. From his control booth, Thomas watched 4 men climb down one by one, their flashlights creating moving circles of illumination in the pit's concrete depth. He counted heads, waited for the 9th man to descend fully, boots finding the bottom rung, stepping onto concrete 20 feet below the suspended chassis. His hand rested on the master conveyor switch. The building held its breath, or perhaps that was just the moment before everything changed, the pause that exists between decision and consequence, when the future hasn't quite arrived, but the past has already surrendered its claim. Then Thomas threw the switch. The conveyor belt screamed back to life with a metallic shriek that drowned out the first shouts from below, and chassis number 17 lurched forward on its track, unfinished steel frame sliding across empty air, where safety grading once caught mistakes. The foreman's flashlights swung wildly in the pit, beams cutting through darkness as they realized the tonnage above them was moving. This is what happens when safety becomes negotiable, and workers remember how to read blueprints. The first chassis dropped at 12:49 a.m., a half-assembled Thunderbird frame weighing 1,700 pounds that fell 15 feet with the inevitability of gravity and the precision of careful planning. It struck the pit floor with a sound like a building collapse compressed into a single percussion metal on concrete, frame rails buckling, suspension components shattering, and underneath that terrible symphony, sounds that would haunt the 3 non-Jefferson workers for the rest of their lives. Gerald Mackey died instantly, caught directly beneath the impact point. The others scattered like roaches when lights snap on, pressing themselves against pit walls, while overhead the conveyor continued its programmed sequence, advancing the next chassis into position. 7 seconds between drops, the exact interval Marcus had documented during his August reconnaissance. Robert Chen screamed for the emergency ladder, but Raymond Jefferson had been busy during the shift's first hour. Every ladder rung above the 8-foot mark had been quietly hacksawed partway through, weakened enough that they'd support a man's weight climbing down, but snap under the panicked scrambling of someone climbing up. Chen made it 4 rungs before the metal gave way, dropping him back into the pit where chassis number 18 was already sliding into position overhead. The foreman who survived the first 2 drops tried the emergency exits, reinforced doors designed to allow rapid evacuation from the pit level in case of fire or chemical spill. Vincent Delacroix threw his full weight against the east exit. The door didn't budge. He tried again, shoulder bruising against steel, not yet understanding that the door had been welded shut from the outside 3 hours earlier while he'd been upstairs in the break room, drinking coffee and joking about triple-time rates. From pit level, the factory floor became a ceiling of machinery and indifference. The overhead conveyor transported death in increments, each chassis a guillotine blade on a timer. The Jeffersons worked their stations with the focus of men who'd practiced every movement, who knew exactly where to stand and when to move and which tasks required their immediate attention far from the pit area. Marcus bolted doors. Deshawn attached hoods. Raymond ran welds that sparked blue-white across metal surfaces. They moved through choreography, refined over 12 weeks of kitchen table planning, each action defensible, each position documented by time cards and production logs. The other 3 workers, 2 spot welders and a parts handler, had been told only that something was going to happen to make management pay attention to safety violations. They hadn't asked for details, hadn't wanted to know. Now they stood at their stations, hands moving through familiar tasks while their minds tried to process the screaming from below, the periodic thunder of falling chassis. The way Thomas Jefferson sat motionless in the control booth, watching carnage unfold with the expression of a man reading weather reports. What would you do, standing 15 feet from mass murder, disguised as equipment malfunction, knowing that intervention meant implicating yourself, that silence meant survival? Would you run for help? Hit an emergency stop? Or would you keep welding, keep moving, keep your head down and your mouth shut because you'd seen what happened to workers who made trouble? The spot welders kept welding. By 12:57 a.m., 6 foremen lay dead or dying in the pit. The survivors, 3 men, pressed against the north wall, away from the chassis drop zone, shouted for help that wouldn't arrive. Their voices echoed in concrete spaces, competing with machine noise, eventually weakening to hoarse pleas that sounded almost like apologies. The phone system had been dead since midnight 15, when Marcus had excused himself for a bathroom break that took him past the second-floor relay room. The cut wires would be discovered Monday morning by maintenance staff, who'd assume vandalism or equipment failure, who'd file reports that would disappear into the same bureaucratic void that had swallowed safety complaints for months. 1:03 a.m. Line Chief Howard Brixton, Leon Briggs's supervisor, the man who'd signed off on the incident report, calling an amputation worker error, tried climbing his dead colleagues like stairs, using bodies as stepping stones toward the pit's lip. He made it 7 feet before the next chassis dropped, pinning him against the north wall with the specific physics of mass and momentum. His screaming stopped. The conveyor continued. Industrial execution requires no malice, only indifference. Thomas monitored the control panel from his booth, watching indicator lights track chassis progression. The system was designed to prevent jams, to maintain steady flow, to prioritize production continuity above all else. He'd simply activated protocols that management had written, executed commands that corporate efficiency demanded. The machinery did exactly what it was built to do. At 1:15 a.m., Deshawn Jefferson walked to the electrical room carrying his lunch pail and a profound understanding of 1940s building codes. The Jefferson Avenue plant's original electrical system used cloth-wrapped wiring that had been flagged for replacement in a 1962 safety audit, an audit whose recommendations had been deferred pending budget approval for 4 years running. Cloth wiring burns beautifully when exposed to accelerant. The fire started in junction box 7, spreading along vintage wiring with the enthusiasm of flame-meeting fuel. Smoke detectors triggered within 90 seconds, but the alarm system routed through the same phone lines Marcus had cut an hour earlier. The sprinkler system designed for the factory floor, not electrical rooms, remained dormant, while smoke filled the junction space with acrid black clouds that carried the smell of burning insulation and corporate negligence. Deshawn closed the electrical room door, wedged it shut with a length of steel pipe, and returned to his station. He attached another hood, logged the completion, moved to the next chassis. His hands shook slightly. He forced them still. By 1:22 a.m., smoke had spread through ventilation ducts to the administrative offices on the third floor, triggering the building's ancient fire suppression protocols, the wartime lockdown systems that Thomas had discovered in stolen blueprints. Heavy steel doors slammed down across major corridors, sealing sections automatically, trapping smoke and people in compartments designed to contain explosions. The foreman in the pit felt the building's systems activate through vibrations in concrete walls. The overhead conveyor finally stopped not from human intervention, but because the fire had killed power to the eastern electrical panel. Chassis number 23 sat half-positioned above the pit, its shadow falling across 4 survivors who'd pressed themselves into the northwest corner where a drainage pipe provided minimal shelter. Assistant Chen, Foreman Martinez, Supervisor Delacroix, and Line Chief Brixton had survived through mathematics of position and luck. They huddled in darkness now. The fire had killed the overhead lights, listening to their own breathing and the building's settling groans, and somewhere distant, the crackle of electrical fire consuming infrastructure. 1:30 a.m. Raymond Jefferson descended a maintenance ladder near the pit's south end, carrying a welding torch and the final component of the Cousins' plan. The survivors heard him coming, called out for rescue, their voices cracking with hope and dehydration and terror. Raymond walked to the pit's edge, looked down at 4 men who'd spent months prioritizing production over human safety, and began welding the emergency ladder's mounting bolts directly to the pit wall. Not removing the ladder that would look suspicious, simply ensuring it could never be moved, never be repositioned, never provide escape for anyone trapped below. "Please," someone begged from the darkness. Raymond completed the welds, inspected his work with a critical eye, and returned to the factory floor without speaking. His face held no expression. His hands maintained steady pressure on the torch trigger. He'd learned welding in a Navy shipyard, had learned that some joints needed to be permanent, that some structures were designed never to come apart. He climbed back to the main level and resumed his station. At 1:41 a.m., the electrical fire reached the main transformer, causing a cascading failure that dropped the entire factory into darkness. Emergency lighting activated battery-powered floods positioned near exits and critical equipment. Their pale illumination turned the assembly floor into a landscape of shadows and hulking machinery, everything familiar rendered alien by emergency's stark light. The 3 non-Jefferson workers finally broke, running for the main entrance while Thomas watched from the control booth. He didn't stop them. They'd seen nothing that could be proved, knew nothing that could be articulated in court. They'd tell stories about equipment failure, about the confusion of darkness and smoke, about how the Jefferson cousins had stayed at their stations trying to control the malfunction while others fled. Heroes staying at their posts during catastrophe. That's how the narrative would read. The main entrance doors opened easily, no welds there, no sabotage. The fleeing workers disappeared into September night, running toward neighbors' houses to call fire departments, to raise alarms, to summon help that would arrive exactly too late. In the pit, 4 men waited in darkness, broken only by the faint glow of emergency lighting filtering through gaps in the chassis above them. They'd stopped shouting, stopped hoping. They simply waited for whatever came next, rescue or death, or the gradual realization that in this concrete tomb, there might be no difference. The cousins worked until 2:07 a.m., when distant sirens announced the approaching fire department. They shut down their stations in proper sequence, logged their final entries on production sheets, collected their lunch pails and thermoses. They walked toward the main entrance together, faces smudged with soot and honest exhaustion. 4 factory workers escaping a catastrophic equipment failure that would be investigated, analyzed, and ultimately filed under industrial accident. Behind them, smoke rose from electrical rooms. Above them, chassis hung suspended on dead conveyors. Below them, in a pit that would take fire crews 40 minutes to access through welded doors and sealed corridors, 4 men discovered what it meant to be collateral in someone else's calculations of acceptable loss. The Jefferson cousins emerged into cool September air, standing in the parking lot while fire trucks screamed toward the plant, and none of them looked back. Fire Captain Theodore Walsh stepped through the Jefferson Avenue plant's main entrance at 2:33 a.m. and encountered smoke thick enough to taste chemical burn mixing with electrical fire, the specific flavor of insulation melting inside walls while beneath his boots, the floor trembled with the vibration of machinery that hadn't quite died. His flashlight beam cut through haze that turned the assembly floor into a landscape from a fever dream, all shadows and hulking shapes that might have been equipment or might have been something worse. The survivors in the pit had 40 minutes left to wait, and every second lasted an hour. Walsh's crew deployed with practiced efficiency, 2 teams splitting to locate the fire's origin while a third checked for casualties. They found the electrical room still smoldering, junction boxes melted into abstract sculpture, wiring reduced to carbon threads. The fire itself had burned out, starved of oxygen in the sealed room, suffocated by its own smoke, leaving behind the kind of damage that would make insurance investigators salivate over subrogation potential. But the smoke had traveled, infiltrating the entire facility through ventilation systems designed to circulate air, not contain disaster. Walsh ordered a complete sweep, standard protocol for industrial incidents, not yet knowing that 4 men were trapped in a concrete pit 15 feet below the assembly floor. The Jefferson cousins stood in the parking lot with perhaps 30 other workers who'd evacuated from neighboring facilities. Drawn by sirens and smoke and the universal human instinct to witness catastrophe from a safe distance, Marcus kept his lunch pail tucked under one arm, its weight familiar and incriminating. Deshawn studied the fire trucks with apparent concern, asking questions of nearby workers about whether the whole block might need evacuation. Raymond smoked a cigarette with the deliberate calm of a man waiting for a bus. Thomas said nothing, watching flames reflect in fire truck chrome. A Detroit police cruiser arrived at 2:48 a.m. Officers Kowalski and Hughes responding to reports of industrial fire with possible casualties. They began taking statements from workers in the parking lot, documenting who'd been inside when the incident began, who'd seen what, who might provide useful witness testimony. Started with the conveyor malfunctioning, one of the fleeing spot welders told Kowalski, his voice still shaking, just stopped, then started again, and things started falling. And then the fire alarms, everything happened so fast. Anyone injured? Kowalski asked, pen poised over his notepad. Don't know. The supervisors were checking something near the maintenance pit when everything went wrong. We ran. I don't know if they got out. The maintenance pit. Walsh received the information via radio at 2:51 a.m. and redirected his search crews. They found the pit access ladder welded solid, its mounting bolts fused to the wall with the kind of professional beadwork that suggested maintenance gone wrong rather than malice. The emergency door's 3 feet of reinforced steel designed for rapid evacuation refused to budge despite hydraulic spreaders and 2 firefighters applying combined body weight. Doors are compromised, Walsh radioed to command. Possible structural failure from the fire. Need cutting equipment for access to lower level. At 3:06 a.m., cutting torches finally breached the east emergency door, revealing the pit's interior through a shower of sparks that illuminated concrete walls streaked with soot and worse. Walsh descended first, gas mask filtering air thick with smoke and the copper penny smell of blood, his flashlight finding bodies arranged in positions that told stories of panic and physics. 6 dead. 4 alive but unresponsive, pressed against the northwest corner, eyes reflecting flashlight beams with the blank stare of shock. From Captain Walsh's incident report, filed September 4, 1966. Victims located in maintenance pit below main assembly line. Preliminary assessment suggests multiple casualties from falling machinery during equipment malfunction. Survivors in traumatic shock. Advanced medical response required. The survivors, Chen, Martinez, Delacroix, and Brixton, were extracted by 3:27 a.m., loaded into ambulances that screamed toward Detroit Receiving Hospital with injuries ranging from crushed limbs to internal bleeding, to psychological trauma that would require decades to even partially process. They weren't talking yet. Couldn't talk. Really just stared at paramedics with eyes that had watched 6 colleagues die in incremental drops of automotive steel. The dead came up slower. Body bags zipped against the September night. Gerald Mackey, Robert Chen's assistant supervisor, Howard Brixton's line chief, Vincent Delacroix's day shift counterpart, and 2 foremen whose names would appear in Monday's Detroit Free Press alongside photographs of families demanding answers. Answers that were already being manufactured in parking lot conversations and carefully coordinated witness statements. Detective Sergeant Frank Garrison arrived at 4:15 a.m. Homicide Division, called in, because 6 industrial deaths in a single incident required investigation beyond fire marshal jurisdiction. He was a 20-year veteran who'd worked the Purple Gang's final years, who understood Detroit's particular relationship with organized violence, disguised as business operations. He interviewed the Jefferson cousins' separately standard procedure, looking for inconsistencies in their accounts. "Walk me through your night," Garrison said to Marcus. The 2 men sitting in the plant's break room while crime scene technicians photographed the pit. Marcus's story held the dull consistency of truth. Arrived at 11:45 p.m., clocked in, began his shift bolting driver's side doors to chassis as they came down the line. First indication of trouble was the conveyor stopping around 12:45 a.m. Supervisors went to investigate. He kept working his station, couldn't abandon his post during production. That'd be a write-up. Then the conveyor restarted, and he heard sounds from below but couldn't see what was happening because of his position on the line. Fire started maybe an hour later, Marcus continued, his voice carrying the exhaustion of a man who'd worked midnight shift and witnessed catastrophe. Smelled smoke. Saw it coming through the vents. We tried to keep working until the evacuation order, but the lights died, and we couldn't see, so we headed for the exits. You didn't think to check on the supervisors in the pit? Marcus met Garrison's eyes with the steady gaze of a man who'd been questioned before. Detective, when fire breaks out in a factory and the lights die, you follow evacuation protocol. Get out. Let the professionals handle it. That's what safety training teaches. The story matched Deshawn's account, Raymond's account, Thomas's account. Matched the fleeing workers' statements. Matched the physical evidence of electrical fire and equipment malfunction. 4 men had stayed at their stations, trying to maintain control during a catastrophic failure, had evacuated only when conditions became untenable. Heroes. Almost. Or at least conscientious employees following procedures. Garrison's instincts screamed that something was wrong. 6 dead in a pit. Doors welded shut. Ladder sabotaged. Fire starting at the exact moment to maximize confusion. But instinct wasn't evidence. Suspicion wasn't proof. And every witness told the same story about equipment failure and bad timing and the kind of industrial accident that happened when companies prioritize production over safety. He walked the factory floor at sunrise, studying the scene with eyes trained to see violence through chaos. The chassis positioned over the pit, the conveyor's emergency brake, the welded doors, the cut phone lines, each piece individually explainable: maintenance error, safety system failure, fire damage, equipment deterioration. Together they suggested choreography, but proving choreography required finding the choreographer's notes. What would you do? Standing in a facility where 6 men died because they climbed into a pit at exactly the wrong moment, where every piece of evidence suggested careful planning but no proof existed beyond the symmetry of coincidence? Would you trust your instincts? Follow procedure? Or would you consider that sometimes accidents happen, that industrial facilities kill workers with bureaucratic regularity, that justice might exist outside the law? The factory's time cards showed the Jefferson cousins had clocked in at normal times, had taken standard breaks, had logged production numbers consistent with their usual output. The security guard, a 63-year-old man working nights to supplement his pension, confirmed seeing them arrive, couldn't recall anything unusual about their behavior or movements. The other workers' statements never mentioned the Jeffersons acting suspiciously, never suggested coordination or conspiracy. Just 4 cousins working their regular stations during an overtime shift that ended in catastrophe. By 8 a.m., the sun had risen over Detroit's east side, painting the Jefferson Avenue plant in golden light that made the soot-stained walls look almost beautiful. The bodies had been transported to the morgue. The survivors remained sedated at Detroit Receiving. The plant stood silent except for investigators documenting everything, photographing burn patterns and measuring the distance between the pit and the control booth, and trying to reconstruct how 6 men died while others worked 15 feet away. The Jeffersons had given their statements and been released. No reason to hold them, no charges to file, no evidence beyond circumstantial timing. They drove home separately, following the same routes they took every morning after midnight shift, parking in front of row houses that had sheltered their families for 2 generations. Marcus entered his kitchen, placed his lunch pail on the counter, and stood at the sink, washing his hands with the thoroughness of a surgeon preparing for operation. The bolt cutters went into his basement toolbox, nested among legitimate equipment, indistinguishable from the implements of honest labor. Deshaun poured the contents of his thermos down the drain, coffee and hydraulic line cutters both disappearing into Detroit's sewer system, evidence dissolving like morning mist. Raymond cleaned his welding kit, storing the portable torch in his garage alongside regulators and tanks and all the tools of his trade, everything properly maintained and completely legal. Thomas sat at his kitchen table and wrote nothing, said nothing, simply existed in the space between what happened and what would be officially recorded, understanding that history was written by whoever controlled the paperwork. The insurance investigators would arrive Monday morning, armed with actuarial tables and subrogation clauses, and a profound desire to avoid paying death benefits for 6 supervisors killed during overtime shifts. Their investigation would determine whether United Auto Manufacturing bore liability for equipment failure or whether the deceased's estates could pursue wrongful death claims. That investigation would change everything, uncovering patterns the police had missed and connections that suggested the Jefferson Avenue incident was something far more calculated than accidental catastrophe. But for now, on this Sunday morning in early September, 4 cousins slept the sleep of exhausted workers, while 6 families began planning funerals, and 4 survivors lay in hospital beds, reliving the sound of chassis frames dropping through darkness. The pit remains sealed, waiting for OSHA investigators and insurance adjusters and corporate lawyers who would spend months analyzing what took 12 weeks to plan and 12 minutes to execute. Justice, according to the Jeffersons, had been served on an assembly line. The insurance adjuster's briefcase clicked open on Tuesday morning at 9:17 a.m., releasing the smell of leather and litigation into the UAM corporate conference room where executives sat arranged like defendants awaiting verdict. Harold Vance from Midwestern Industrial Casualty spread photographs of the pit across polished, mahogany-glossy 8x10s, showing twisted chassis frames and body-shaped voids in concrete dust, while his assistant documented every facial expression with the detached interest of someone calculating liability in human lives. This is when careful planning meets professional skepticism, and numbers start revealing patterns invisible to grief. Vance had spent 19 years investigating industrial claims, had seen workers crushed by equipment and burned in chemical fires and asphyxiated in grain silos, understood the difference between accident and incident. The Jefferson Avenue deaths bothered him immediately, not emotionally, but mathematically. 6 fatalities in a single confined space during a holiday overtime shift, with emergency systems failing in precise sequence, while the fire conveniently destroyed documentation and communication systems. The probability curve looked wrong. "Walk me through your safety protocols," Vance said to plant manager Douglas Kershaw, a soft-handed man whose corner office contained photographs of assembly lines, but no evidence he'd ever worked one. Specifically, the maintenance pit access procedures. Kershaw shuffled papers, buying time. Standard protocol requires safety grading to be in place whenever the conveyor's operational. Removal only happens during scheduled maintenance, documented in the shift log. And who authorizes grading removal? The line supervisor or designated maintenance crew chief. Vance flipped through his notes. According to your shift logs, no maintenance was scheduled for Labor Day weekend, yet the grating was found in a supply closet, signed out at 11:40 p.m. Saturday under authorization code M732. He paused, letting silence do the interrogation work. That's your code, Mr. Kershaw. The room temperature seemed to drop. Kershaw's face flushed red, then pale. There must be some mistake. I wasn't even in the facility that night. Precisely. Someone had used his authorization code without permission, which meant either security breach or inside job. Vance noted Kershaw's discomfort with the satisfaction of a man watching dominoes arrange themselves for falling. From Midwestern Industrial Casualty Preliminary Report, September 8, 1966. Multiple irregularities suggest possible criminal activity. Recommend police investigation expansion beyond accidental death determination. The OSHA investigators arrived Wednesday, 2 federal inspectors armed with clipboards, and the authority to shut down any facility deemed unsafe. They documented 47 separate code violations within the first 3 hours, bypassed safety interlocks, removed machine guards, inadequate fire suppression, blocked emergency exits. Some violations were fresh, damage from the weekend incident. Others had existed for months or years, the accumulated negligence of a company that treated safety regulations like suggestions. But the investigators found something else, something that shifted the entire case into darker territory. The emergency ladder's mounting bolts showed evidence of recent welding. Not fire damage, deliberate modification. The weld beads were clean, professional, consistent with work done by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. This wasn't heat damage, Inspector Grantham told his partner, photographing the welds from multiple angles. Someone sealed this ladder permanently, before the incident, not during. The question became, who had access to welding equipment and the skill to execute precision work without supervision? Raymond Jefferson's employment file showed Navy shipyard training and 15 years of spot welding experience. His workstation was located 30 feet from the nearest pit access point. His time card showed a bathroom break at 1:07 a.m., 13 minutes unaccounted for. More than enough time to weld ladder bolts if you'd practiced the technique until it became muscle memory. Detective Garrison received the OSHA report Thursday afternoon and felt vindication mixed with dread. His instincts had been correct. The Jefferson Avenue deaths were murder disguised as industrial accident. But proving it meant unraveling a conspiracy that had been executed with the precision of military operation by men who understood that factory environments provided perfect cover for violence. He requested the survivors be interviewed again, this time under the assumption they were witnesses to homicide rather than victims of equipment failure. Robert Chen had lost his left leg below the knee, crushed between chassis frame and concrete wall. He lay in Detroit Receiving Surgical Ward, morphine keeping the worst pain at bay, eyes tracking the ceiling tiles with the blank focus of trauma. Garrison pulled a chair beside the bed, notepad ready. "I need you to think carefully about Saturday night," Garrison began, voice gentle but insistent. "Before the conveyor restarted, before the chassis started falling, did you notice anything unusual? Anyone acting strangely?" Chen's jaw worked silently for several seconds. The Jefferson cousins, they were all there, all 4 of them, working the same shift. "Is that unusual?" "Not really. They often work together. But," Chen's eyes closed, remembering, "they didn't react when the screaming started. Everyone else was running, panicking, and they just kept working, like they expected it." Premeditated indifference, the most damning evidence. Line Chief Vincent Delacroix, recovering from broken ribs and punctured lung, told Garrison about the welded doors. How he'd thrown his weight against the east exit, expecting it to open, expecting salvation, and instead found sealed steel that suggested someone had known they'd try to escape that way. "Those doors were fine Friday afternoon," Delacroix wheezed. "I used them myself during shift change. Someone welded them shut between Friday and Saturday night." Assistant Foreman Martinez remembered the ladder rung snapping under Chen's weight. "Bad maintenance," we thought. But now, he trailed off, unwilling to complete the thought, unwilling to admit he'd been trapped in a murder scene designed with the attention to detail that characterized assembly line production. The fourth survivor, Line Chief Brixton Leon Briggs's former supervisor, refused to speak at all, just stared at the wall, occasionally muttering about chassis frames falling like guillotines, about how the building had turned into a machine designed to kill its operators. Perfect machinery requires perfect planning. By Friday, Garrison had enough for search warrants. He arrived at Marcus Jefferson's row house at 6 a.m. with 4 uniformed officers and the specific determination of a man who'd spent too many years watching guilty people walk free on technicalities. The bolt cutters were found exactly where Marcus had left them, nested in his basement toolbox among legitimate tools, their cutting edges showing microscopic traces of galvanized steel, consistent with safety grating support cables. Deshawn's thermos, washed thoroughly, but still carrying chemical residue that field tests identified as hydraulic fluid, the kind used in industrial line cutters. Raymond's welding kit contained a portable acetylene torch whose nozzle showed residue matching the composition of the emergency ladder's mounting bolts. Thomas's control booth access card had been swiped at midnight, 02 a.m., 11 minutes before the conveyor malfunction began, despite his statement claiming he'd remained at the controls continuously from midnight to 2 a.m. The physical evidence formed a web of circumstantial proof that looked damning in aggregate, but proved nothing definitively. Yes, Marcus owned bolt cutters, so did half the factory workers in Detroit. Deshawn's thermos contained hydraulic fluid. He worked near hydraulic systems. Raymond had welding equipment. He was a professional welder. Thomas accessed the control booth that was literally his job, each piece individually meaningless. Together they suggested conspiracy. What would you do if you were Detective Garrison, holding evidence that screamed guilt but whispered reasonable doubt, knowing that 4 black factory workers had probably killed 6 white supervisors in calculated revenge, understanding that proving it meant confronting a community that viewed the deaths as justified response to corporate negligence that had already killed a teenager and maimed a veteran? Would you pursue justice, maintain order, or would you recognize that some crimes emerge from injustices so profound that legal categories become inadequate to describe them? Garrison arrested all 4 Jefferson cousins on Friday afternoon, September 9, 1966, charged with 6 counts of first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder. The arrests made the Detroit Free Press front page, not because of the crime's severity, but because of what it represented. Black workers striking back against white management, industrial warfare disguised as equipment failure, class conflict turning Detroit's factories into battlegrounds. The UAM Executive Board held emergency meetings. The UAW local demanded the charges be dropped, calling the arrests racist persecution of workers who'd tried to maintain operations during catastrophic equipment failure. Community leaders organized protests. Defense attorneys volunteered their services pro bono. The trial would become a referendum on labor relations, racial justice, and the value of working-class lives versus management comfort. But before any of that could unfold, the insurance company made a discovery that changed everything. Harold Vance found Leon Briggs's injury report from April 14th buried in UAM's archived safety complaints, found Darnell Hughes's death certificate from July 29th, found 17 separate safety violations documented by workers, all filed properly, all vanished between union office and executive response, found evidence that UAM management had known about the dangers, had bypassed safety systems deliberately to maintain production quotas, had valued profit margins over human bodies with the calculated certainty of men who'd never risk their own hands in the machinery. The company that had killed 2 workers and maimed a third through negligence was now demanding justice for 6 supervisors killed by the consequences of that negligence. Vance sent his findings to Detroit's prosecutor office with a cover letter that concluded, "Recommend criminal charges against UAM executives for negligent homicide and willful safety violations prior to consideration of charges against plant workers." The prosecutor read the letter twice, understanding immediately that the case had just become politically radioactive in a city where the auto industry employed a third of the workforce and labor tensions were reaching breaking points that would, within a year, ignite into full-scale rebellion. Justice was about to get complicated. The Wayne County Courthouse steps filled with protesters at 8 a.m. on Monday, September 12th. Their signs reading, "Justice for Leon," and "Corporate Murder," and "UM Kills Workers," while television cameras captured images that would run on evening news broadcasts across the Midwest. Inside, the Jefferson cousins sat in holding cells, waiting for arraignment. And outside, their neighborhood had transformed into something between vigil and uprising. When workers become defendants, the assembly line itself goes on trial. The courtroom smelled of furniture polish and old radiator heat, wooden benches packed with supporters who'd taken unpaid time off work to attend the hearing. Judge Theodore Morrison presided, a 28-year veteran known for labor sympathy, appointed during the Roosevelt administration when unions were democracy's answer to fascism rather than obstacles to profit margins. Prosecutor David Hastings stood to present charges, his voice carrying the careful neutrality of a man navigating political landmines. 6 counts of first-degree murder, conspiracy, criminal destruction of property. The litany of accusations painted the Jeffersons as calculated killers who'd turned an automobile factory into an execution chamber with premeditation so thorough it suggested months of planning. Defense attorney Ruth Morrison, no relation to the judge, though she shared his New Deal sensibilities, countered with a motion to dismiss based on prosecutorial overreach. "Your Honor, my clients are being charged with murder for the crime of working their assigned stations during an industrial accident. The prosecution offers no direct evidence of planning, no witnesses to conspiracy, only circumstantial connections that could describe any factory worker's normal activities." She gestured toward the gallery, where Leon Briggs sat in the front row, his right sleeve pinned neatly where his arm used to be. The real crime here began months before September 3rd, when UAM management bypassed safety systems that cost Leon Briggs his arm, when they ignored warnings that cost Darnell Hughes his life, when they prioritized production quotas over human bodies until workers had no choice but to "counsel," Judge Morrison interrupted, though his tone suggested he was listening carefully. "We're here for arraignment, not closing arguments." The Jeffersons pleaded not guilty. Bail was set at $50,000 each, astronomical sums for factory workers earning $3.40 an hour. Within 6 hours, the UAW Local 23 had raised the full amount through membership contributions, each worker donating what they could spare, understanding that the men in those cells had done what the union couldn't, made management pay in blood for blood already spilled. The cousins walked free at 4:30 p.m., emerging from the courthouse to cheers and flashbulbs and a community that had decided these men were heroes, regardless of what any jury might determine. But freedom came with conditions. House arrest, no contact with each other, electronic monitoring bracelets that would track their movements, new technology being tested in Wayne County, making the Jeffersons guinea pigs for surveillance that would eventually spread nationwide. The real investigation was just beginning. Detective Garrison spent September interviewing every worker who'd been employed at the Jefferson Avenue plant during the past year, building timelines and checking alibis, and searching for the smoking gun that would prove premeditation beyond reasonable doubt. He found something better, a pattern. From Garrison's case notes, September 15th, 1966. Worker testimony reveals organized study group meeting in Marcus Jefferson's basement, ostensibly for Bible study. Attendees included all 4 defendants, plus 12 other plant employees. Topics discussed: justice, retribution, Old Testament eye for an eye principles. Witnesses claim purely religious discussions, but timing coincides with post-Hughes' death period. The Bible study meetings had been real. Marcus's neighbors confirmed seeing workers arrive Wednesday evenings carrying worn Bibles and thermoses of coffee, staying for 2 hours before dispersing. But the neighbors also remembered something else: blueprints visible through basement windows during one session, technical drawings spread across tables where scripture should have been. Garrison obtained a warrant to search Marcus's house again, this time looking for the photographed blueprints. He found nothing. They'd been burned weeks earlier, ashes scattered in the vegetable garden behind the row house. But he found something almost as valuable. A library book checked out in Marcus's name on July 5th, returned August 2nd. The title, Industrial Safety Systems and Emergency Protocols. The book's checkout card showed it had been borrowed 16 times in 3 years, unusual for a technical manual. Garrison tracked down other borrowers, finding a network of factory workers across Detroit who'd been educating themselves on safety systems, emergency shutoffs, and the architectural vulnerabilities of buildings designed in the 1940s. Self-education as conspiracy planning. The UAM executives, meanwhile, faced their own legal problems. Harold Vance's insurance report had been forwarded to federal OSHA investigators who'd expanded their inquiry into corporate practices across all UAM facilities. What they found suggested the Jefferson Avenue deaths were symptoms of systemic negligence. 43 factories with bypass safety systems, 87 documented injuries that had been classified as worker error, 12 deaths over 5 years that shared suspicious similarities with Darnell Hughes's tragic accident. United Auto Manufacturing had been killing workers through calculated negligence and calling it the cost of doing business. The company's response was predictable: deny, delay, deflect. Corporate attorneys filed motions to suppress the OSHA findings, claiming investigatory overreach. Public relations firms crafted narratives about a few bad actors, specifically the Jefferson cousins who'd exploited noble company practices for murderous purposes. Executive bonuses that year included provisions for crisis management performance. What would you do if you worked in a factory where management had just been caught systematically bypassing safety systems while simultaneously prosecuting workers for responding to those bypasses with violence? Would you trust the legal system? Continue filing safety complaints? Or would you start studying blueprints yourself, learning which emergency systems could be weaponized if pushed far enough? 3 more Detroit auto plants reported mysterious equipment malfunctions in October, each resulting in injuries to supervisors who'd been flagged by workers as particularly negligent. No fatalities, just broken bones and burns, and the kind of accidents that looked plausible but felt coordinated. Management got the message. The Jefferson case had inspired something: spread techniques, turned factory floors into potential battlegrounds where workers who'd always been vulnerable now understood they could make vulnerability mutual. The trial date was set for January 9th, 1967. Prosecutor Hastings spent the intervening months building his case, accumulating circumstantial evidence that pointed toward guilt the way smoke points toward fire: the bolt cutters, the welding torch, the library book, the Bible study sessions, the timing of bathroom breaks, each piece individually explicable but collectively damning. Defense attorney Morrison built a different narrative. 4 workers doing their jobs during catastrophic equipment failure caused by management negligence. She subpoenaed UAM safety records, deposed executives about bypassed interlocks, documented every injury that had been dismissed as worker error. Her strategy wasn't to prove the Jeffersons innocent that ship had sailed, but to prove that UAM's guilt was greater, that corporate murder through negligence deserved prosecution more than workers' murder through desperation. The survivors became pawns in competing narratives. Robert Chen, missing his leg, testified in depositions about hearing the Jefferson cousins' lack of surprise when the screaming started. But he also testified about the bypassed safety systems, about management's refusal to address complaints, about the culture of production uber alles that had created conditions where tragedy became inevitable. Vincent Delacroix spoke about the welded doors, the sabotaged ladder, the feeling of being trapped in a concrete tomb. He also spoke about signing off on safety bypass authorizations because refusing meant termination, meant losing the pension he was 6 months from claiming, meant choosing between principles and survival in a system designed to make that choice impossible. Line Chief Brixton never spoke publicly. He checked out of Detroit Receiving on October 3rd against medical advice, drove to his sister's house in Cleveland, and was found dead 3 weeks later from what the coroner ruled accidental overdose of prescribed pain medication. His suicide note, if it was suicide, mentioned Darnell Hughes's name 17 times. Guilt has its own mortality rate. By December, the case had evolved beyond simple criminal prosecution into a cultural flashpoint. Civil rights leaders framed it as racist persecution of black workers defending themselves against white management. Labor organizers saw it as class warfare. Conservative politicians used it as evidence of social breakdown, requiring law and order crackdowns. Everyone had an interpretation. Nobody had clean hands. The Detroit Free Press ran a series called Assembly Line Justice, interviewing workers across the auto industry about safety conditions and management accountability. The responses revealed a landscape of simmering rage. Bypassed safety systems were standard practice. Injuries were routinely misclassified. Complaints vanished into bureaucratic voids. The Jefferson Avenue deaths weren't anomalies. They were the logical conclusion of systems designed to value production over people. One interview stood out. A line worker at Ford River Rouge who spoke anonymously. What those Jefferson boys did? That's just the first chapter. Management thinks they can keep killing us and calling it accidents. But we're learning. We're planning. And next time, there won't be any bodies to investigate. The quote ran on page 3. Ford executives demanded the worker be identified and fired. The newspaper refused, citing source protection. The worker was never found, but his message echoed through factory break rooms across Detroit. The rules had changed. Power wasn't unidirectional anymore, and the machinery that had always threatened workers could be turned against the men who controlled it. On Christmas Eve, someone left a fruit basket on plant manager Kershaw's doorstep, identical to the one UAM had sent Leon Briggs after his amputation, complete with cellophane wrap and a card reading, "Wishing you a speedy recovery." The implicit threat was clear enough that Kershaw moved his family to a hotel and hired private security. The trial was 3 weeks away, and Detroit was holding its breath, waiting to see whether 4 factory workers would be convicted for murdering the men whose negligence had killed their friends, whether justice existed in legal systems designed to protect exactly the power structures that created conditions for revenge. The Jefferson cousins spent Christmas in their row houses, ankle monitors tracking their movements, knowing that January would determine whether they died in prison or became legends in a movement that was just beginning to understand its own potential for organized violence. The assembly line had taught them patience, precision, and the value of proper sequencing. Now the legal system would test whether those skills transferred to courtroom warfare. The jury foreman's hand trembled as he unfolded. The verdict slip at 3:47 p.m. on January 23, 1967, his fingers leaving sweat marks on paper that would determine whether 4 men spent their lives in prison or walked free into a Detroit winter that waited outside the courthouse like held breath. Judge Morrison's courtroom held 200 spectators packed shoulder to shoulder, and the silence before the reading was so complete you could hear radiator pipes ticking behind the walls. This is when 12 strangers decide whether killing your oppressors constitutes murder or mathematics. The trial had consumed 14 days of testimony, 37 witnesses, and enough circumstantial evidence to fill 3 evidence boxes that sat stacked beside the prosecution table like accusations made solid. Prosecutor Hastings had built his case with the methodical precision of a man constructing gallows. Each piece of evidence, another plank, another rope strand, another step toward the platform where the Jeffersons would hang metaphorically, if not literally. He'd presented the bolt cutters found in Marcus's basement, their cutting edges microscopically matched to the severed safety grating cables. The thermos containing hydraulic fluid residue, Raymond's welding torch with its telltale chemical signature, Thomas's control booth access card showing the 11-minute gap that coincided perfectly with the conveyor malfunction's timing. These are not coincidences, Hastings had told the jury during closing arguments. his voice carrying the righteous certainty of a man who believed in law's supremacy over grievance. These are the tools of premeditated murder. The defendants studied their victims' routines, learned the facility's vulnerabilities, and executed a plan so thorough that 6 men died without a chance of escape. That's not justice, that's execution. But defense attorney Morrison had countered with something more dangerous than evidence: context. She'd called Leon Briggs to the stand on day 4, his empty sleeve pinned neatly, his testimony delivered in the flat affect of a man who'd stopped expecting fairness from institutions designed to protect him. He described the press that had taken his arm, the bypassed safety interlock that management knew was disabled, the incident report that blamed him for reaching into machinery that should never have been accessible during operation. "Did UAM offer you compensation beyond the disability discharge?" Morrison asked. "A fruit basket," Briggs replied. And the courtroom had erupted in bitter laughter that Judge Morrison hadn't tried very hard to silence. She'd presented OSHA documentation of 47 safety violations at Jefferson Avenue plant, some dating back 5 years. She'd shown the jury photographs of bypassed interlocks, removed safety guards, emergency exits blocked by equipment. She'd demonstrated that United Auto Manufacturing had been systematically dismantling the infrastructure designed to keep workers alive, trading human safety for marginal production increases. That meant bigger executive bonuses. Darnell Hughes's mother had testified on day 7, a tiny woman in her Sunday dress who spoke about her 17-year-old son's dreams of community college, his optimism about factory work providing tuition money, the closed casket funeral necessitated by what industrial machinery had done to his body. Her testimony lasted 12 minutes and reduced 3 jurors to visible tears. "Management knew that press was dangerous," Mrs. Hughes said, her voice never rising but somehow filling the entire courtroom. "They knew, and they let my baby work it anyway, because temporary workers were cheaper than fixing the problem. You want to talk about murder? My son was murdered for profit margins." The prosecution objected. Judge Morrison sustained. But the jury had heard it, had absorbed the moral equation that made the Jefferson Avenue deaths look less like crime and more like consequence. What would you do if you sat in that jury box, tasked with determining whether 4 black factory workers had committed murder by turning management's own negligence into a weapon, knowing that acquittal meant endorsing industrial violence but conviction meant ignoring the systemic violence that had provoked it? The jury deliberated for 6 days, an eternity in criminal trials, suggesting deep division and moral wrestling. Twice, they sent notes to Judge Morrison requesting clarification on murder versus manslaughter distinctions, on what constituted premeditation, on whether corporate negligence could be considered mitigating circumstance. Inside the jury room, 12 citizens argued about justice in a system that seemed designed to protect exactly the forces that had created conditions for revenge. The foreman was a tool and die maker from Hamtramck who understood factory work's dangers. 3 jurors were housewives who'd never set foot in industrial facilities. 2 were small business owners who viewed property rights as sacred. 1 was a Korean War veteran who understood calculated violence. 5 were auto workers themselves, intimately familiar with the daily negotiations between survival and safety that the trial had exposed. From jury deliberation notes, later obtained through FOIA request. The question isn't whether the defendants killed those men. The question is whether the law recognizes any difference between murder and execution when the victims were themselves guilty of murder through negligence. The deadlock lasted through the weekend. On Monday, the jury sent another note. If we cannot reach unanimous verdict, what happens? Judge Morrison responded with standard instructions about hung juries and mistrials, knowing that sending this case back for retrial would likely ignite the kind of civil unrest Detroit had been brewing toward for years. The city waited. The auto industry waited. The labor movement waited. And in 4 separate row houses under house arrest, the Jefferson cousins waited with the particular patience of men who'd spent decades working assembly lines, who understood that some processes couldn't be rushed, who knew that quality work required proper timing. Tuesday afternoon, the jury finally reached verdict. The bailiff summoned everyone back to the courtroom at 3:30 p.m. The gallery filled within minutes supporters, press, curious citizens, and a significant police presence positioned to handle potential unrest regardless of the outcome. The Jeffersons sat at the defense table wearing suits purchased by community fundraising, their faces showing nothing, hands folded with the stillness of men who'd already made peace with whatever came next. Behind them, Leon Briggs sat in the front row. Darnell Hughes's mother sat 3 rows back. The courtroom held 200 people and 50 years of accumulated rage at systems that ground workers into parts as replaceable as the components they assembled. Judge Morrison entered. Everyone rose. The formalities proceeded with the careful choreography that gave legal proceedings their illusion of neutrality. The jury filed in 12 faces, showing exhaustion and something that might have been relief or might have been resignation. Has the jury reached a verdict? Morrison asked. We have, Your Honor. The foreman stood, unfolding the paper that trembled in his grip. He read slowly, clearly, understanding that these words would echo through Detroit's factories for decades. In the matter of the state of Michigan versus Marcus Jefferson, on the charge of first-degree murder, we find the defendant. The pause stretched like molten steel. Not guilty. The courtroom erupted. Shouts of jubilation and outrage competed for dominance, while Judge Morrison's gavel came down repeatedly, demanding order that wouldn't come for several minutes. The foreman continued through the chaos, reading identical verdicts for Deshaun, Raymond, and Thomas. 4 not guilty verdicts on first-degree murder charges. 4 men, walking free from accusations that had seemed insurmountable when the trial began. But the jury had convicted on lesser charges: conspiracy to commit property destruction, criminal negligence, reckless endangerment, sentences of 3 years probation, community service, and restitution payments to the victims' families, slaps on the wrist, compared to the life sentences that had seemed inevitable. Prosecutor Hastings stood frozen at his table, face flushed with the particular rage of a man who'd assembled a perfect case only to watch it crumble against narratives more powerful than evidence. Defense attorney Morrison embraced her clients, tears streaming down her face, understanding that this verdict was less about legal proof than about a jury's determination that some deaths were consequences rather than crimes. The Jeffersons walked out of the Wayne County Courthouse at 4:23 p.m. into a crowd of supporters who'd waited through 6 days of deliberation. News cameras captured images of 4 factory workers raising their fists in victory, of Leon Briggs embracing Marcus Jefferson with his remaining arm, of a community celebrating not the violence itself, but the acknowledgement that workers' lives mattered enough to justify extraordinary response when institutions failed to protect them. UAM executives watched the verdict on television in their corporate offices and understood immediately that the rules had changed. You couldn't kill workers through negligence anymore and expect only paperwork consequences. The Jefferson Avenue deaths had established a new equilibrium. Management violence would be met with worker violence, and juries might decide that equation balanced properly. Within 6 months, United Auto Manufacturing would implement comprehensive safety reforms across all facilities, not from conscience, but from calculation, understanding that preventing revenge was cheaper than defending against it. The 4 cousins returned to their row houses that night, ankle monitors finally removed, free men living in a city that would, within months, erupt into riots that made the Jefferson Avenue deaths look like prologue rather than conclusion. But that Tuesday evening, they sat in Marcus's kitchen drinking coffee and saying nothing, understanding that words couldn't capture what they'd done or what it meant. Justice had been served, though not in the form anyone had expected. And somewhere in Detroit, workers studied blueprints of their own facilities, learning the locations of emergency shutoffs and maintenance pits, understanding that the machinery designed to assemble vehicles could be repurposed for other ends if push came to shove. The assembly line had trained them well. The row houses on Jefferson's block stayed dark for 3 nights after the verdict, curtains drawn against celebration that felt too dangerous to display publicly, while inside those brick walls, Four cousins processed what freedom meant when purchased with 6 deaths and 13 days of testimony that had turned their lives into public spectacle. Marcus sat at his kitchen table on Thursday night, February 2nd, 1967, listening to police sirens in the distance and understanding that the trial's end was just intermission before Detroit's real violence began. The verdict didn't end anything, it authorized everything that came after. United Auto Manufacturing implemented emergency safety reforms within 2 weeks of the acquittal, not quietly, but with press releases and executive statements emphasizing their commitment to worker welfare. Every safety interlock was restored. Guards were reinstalled on machinery. The maintenance pit at Jefferson Avenue plant received new grating welded permanently in place, strong enough to support a fully loaded delivery truck. Emergency exits were inspected weekly. Phone systems were upgraded to include redundant lines that couldn't be disabled by single-point failures. The reforms cost UAM $17 million across their factory network and saved the company from complete dissolution. Because Harold Vance's insurance investigation had revealed something that transcended the Jefferson Avenue incident, a pattern of systematic negligence across the entire corporation that exposed them to liability claims totaling hundreds of millions. The safety reforms were damage control, corporate survival instinct responding to existential threat, but the real changes happened in spaces management couldn't monitor. Factory workers across Detroit began organizing study groups that met in basements and union halls, ostensibly discussing labor rights and collective bargaining, actually sharing blueprints and technical specifications and the accumulated knowledge of how industrial facilities could be turned against those who controlled them. The Jefferson cousins never attended these meetings. Their probation terms prohibited association with labor organizing, but their methods were studied with the reverence usually reserved for military tactics. From a Detroit Police Intelligence Report, March 1967. Increasing evidence of coordinated study among factory workers regarding facility vulnerabilities. No overt criminal planning detected, but subject matter suggests preparation for potential industrial action beyond traditional union activity. Recommend continued monitoring. The monitoring continued until July 23, 1967, when Detroit erupted into 5 days of rebellion that made the Jefferson Avenue deaths look like a warning shot nobody had heeded. The riot, or uprising, depending on perspective, began on 12th Street and spread through the city like fire through dry timber, fueled by the same accumulated rage that had driven 4 cousins to turn an assembly line into an execution chamber. The Jeffersons watched their neighborhood burn on television, understanding that the verdict had emboldened something larger than their personal revenge, had demonstrated that violence against institutional power could succeed if executed with sufficient precision. They'd proved that workers weren't powerless, that the machinery designed to control them could be weaponized, that patience and planning could overcome the asymmetry of formal power structures. What they'd started couldn't be stopped by probation terms or reformed safety protocols. Marcus Jefferson worked the Jefferson Avenue plant until 1973, when automation eliminated his position along with 40% of the facility's workforce. He never spoke publicly about the trial, never granted interviews to journalists who wanted to know what it felt like to be acquitted of mass murder. He lived in his row house until his death from lung cancer in 1994. Asbestos exposure from decades of factory work, the kind of slow industrial violence that didn't make headlines. Deshawn moved to Chicago in 1969, finding work in a steel mill where he taught younger workers about safety protocols and the importance of documentation. He died in 2003, having outlived most of his generation, having watched manufacturing jobs disappear from American cities like morning mist. Raymond continued welding until arthritis made precision work impossible. He spent his retirement teaching free welding classes to neighborhood kids, passing along skills that could provide honest employment or other applications depending on circumstance. His obituary in 2011 mentioned his Navy service and community contributions, but nothing about September 1966. Thomas Jefferson operated overhead cranes at various Detroit facilities until the industry's collapse in 2008. He was the last surviving cousin, dying in 2017 at age 86, taking with him the exact sequence of switches he'd thrown that holiday weekend 51 years earlier. None of them ever admitted guilt. None of them expressed remorse. In rare moments, when pressed by family members about what happened that September night, they responded with variations of the same statement. We did our jobs. The machinery failed. That's what the jury decided. The machinery failed. Perfect deniability, wrapped in truth. The survivors of the pit carried different burdens. Robert Chen, missing his leg, became a vocal advocate for industrial safety reform, testifying before congressional committees about the human cost of corporate negligence. He never publicly accused the Jeffersons of murder, but in private conversations, he acknowledged what everyone knew. The pit had been a trap. The deaths had been deliberate. And the line between justice and murder depended entirely on which side of the power equation you occupied. Vincent Delacroix took early retirement and moved to Florida, as far from assembly lines as geography permitted. He died in 1988, his death certificate listing complications from injuries sustained in an industrial accident 22 years earlier. Assistant Foreman Martinez returned to work at a different UAM facility, where he became known for obsessive attention to safety protocols and a tendency to test emergency exits multiple times per shift. He never entered another maintenance pit, even when procedures required it, always finding reasons why someone else should descend. The Jefferson Avenue plant itself operated until 2004, when global competition and domestic decline finally shuttered its doors. The building sat vacant for 13 years before demolition crews arrived to tear down what had once employed 1,500 workers. When they excavated the maintenance pit, they found it exactly as safety regulations required: grading secure, ladder accessible, emergency exits functional. No evidence remained of what had happened in September 1966, except courthouse records and newspaper archives and the memories of people who'd learned that some stories are better kept than told. But Detroit remembers in the way cities remember trauma, not through official histories, but through whispered legends passed between generations of workers who understand that power isn't permanent and machinery cuts both ways. The Jefferson cousins became ghosts in the industrial landscape. Their names invoked in factory break rooms when safety complaints go ignored, when management prioritizes production over protection, when workers need reminding that they're not as powerless as systems want them to believe. The trial established precedent that prosecutors have spent decades trying to contain. Juries might acquit workers who respond to institutional violence with personal violence if the provocation was sufficient. That precedent haunts corporate boardrooms whenever labor tensions escalate, whenever safety protocols are considered negotiable, whenever executives calculate whether cutting costs is worth the risk that someone might calculate revenge. Safety improved across American manufacturing, not from regulatory enforcement but from fear. The understanding that killing workers through negligence might result in workers killing back through precision. The mathematics of mutual vulnerability. On Jefferson Avenue today, the old plant site is a vacant lot, where grass grows through cracked concrete and kids play basketball on courts painted over factory foundations. Nothing marks what happened there in 1966, except a historical plaque installed by the UAW in 2012, in memory of all workers who lost their lives to industrial accidents and corporate negligence. No names listed, no dates specified, just acknowledgement that the boundary between accident and murder has always been thinner than legal definitions suggest. And on certain September nights, when wind carries the right kind of chill, old-timers swear they can still hear the sound of chassis frames dropping through darkness, the metallic thunder of steel meeting concrete, the machinery of justice grinding bones into lessons that management refused to learn any other way. The Jefferson cousins never paid for another drink in their neighborhood bars, not because people celebrated murder, but because workers understood the difference between crime and consequence. Some debts can only be settled on factory floors, where the machinery runs 24 hours, and safety grading can be removed for maintenance. And men who spend their lives being disposable finally demonstrate that everyone's disposable if you understand the blueprints well enough. Today, workers in Detroit factories still mention the Jefferson Avenue incident when training new hires on safety protocols, though the details have been worn smooth by decades of retelling 9 men who died when the line malfunctioned, 4 cousins who somehow survived to tell no tales, a jury that decided some killings don't qualify as murder when the dead had it coming. Even now, some claim that maintenance crews working late shifts at former auto plants report finding welding marks on door frames that weren't there the previous inspection, or safety grating mysteriously moved without authorization, or blueprint copies left in break rooms showing emergency systems circled in red, silent reminders that the knowledge the Jeffersons weaponized never fully died, just went dormant, waiting for conditions that might require its resurrection. We're only scratching the surface. The next case is even darker. Subscribe before it drops.